We are still letting people in. We have many participants today, so in a couple of minutes we'll begin our program. So be patient with us, please. Maybe a couple more minutes. Perhaps we should begin and let people come as we go along. So good evening and welcome to our 5th talk in a series Elephant in the Room, exploring the future of museum that will focus on old maps and decolonization possibilities. This program was conceived and organized by Stuart Swift Research Center of the Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, Vermont. And we actually hold in our archives sizable collection of historical photographs, of historical maps, which we are in the process of reorganizing and reindexing. So I'm really looking forward to today's talk, and I'm really excited about that. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart. And we acknowledge that we broadcast this program from Dakina, which is the ancestral land of Abenaki peoples, also known as Vermont. I would like to invite you to our next couple of talks. On March 9, Rachel Hope Cleves will talk about what historians can find in archives like ours. And on April 13, Rick Cassini-Kadur will speak about his vision of for museums and their future. So I hope you can join us. I'd like to thank you, Vermont Humanities, for sponsoring this series. Thank you so much. Without this wonderful grant, we wouldn't be able to offer this as a free program for everybody. We also had several additional sponsors, including Vinci of Burlington, as well as several private sponsors. So thank you to all. And if you feel so inclined, we would welcome also donations, which would support programs like this in the future. So thank you for being here and supporting us in person and possibly by donations if you feel so. I also would like to take a moment to offer special thanks to Professor Ellery Fouch of Middlebury College, who teaches in American Studies. She was a wonderful supporter of this series from the beginning and also suggested to me several of the speakers, which one of them will be presenting today. So thank you, Ellery, so much for all your help. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for questions. So if you are welcome to type any questions during the talk. The best is to do it in Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And my colleague Taylor Rossini will moderate the talk afterwards. So this is about all the technicalities. And now I would like to introduce Christine DeLucia, who is Associate Professor at Williams College. In 2018, she published a book, Memory Lands, King Philip's War, and the place of violence in the Northeast, for which she received awards from several organizations, including the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, Massachusetts Historical Society, and New England American Studies Associations, among others. Professor DeLucia teaches and is involved in public humanities projects centering material culture, place-based ways of knowing and remembering, and decolonial approaches. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very grateful to Ava, Taylor, the museum for inviting me to do this presentation tonight, and really looking forward to some questions and discussion at the end. I'm going to share my screen because I have a number of images that I'd like to talk about this evening in the context of maps, the stories they tell, the stories they don't tell, and possibilities going forward to activate older maps in new ways. I'd like to begin, though, before really diving into this topic, with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous homelands from which I am speaking this evening. So I am currently a settler located in the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community, whose valued ancestral homelands continue to be a place of tremendous importance. And the Stockbridge-Munsee community has done extraordinary work to protect, to steward, to tell stories, to maintain ancestral knowledge about these homelands, despite a long and still impactful history of forced removal from these eastern places. And this is also my way of beginning to open this conversation about maps, because, as you'll see, maps have been enormously important in Indigenous communities' lives, in the work they do in settler colonialism, and the impacts it has had. And so sharing here a map that the community often puts out there as part of its own accounting of history that shows this forced removal from eastern homelands all the way over to Wisconsin today, where they are located as a federally recognized tribal nation. But the connections remain, and that is where I want to go today, to talk with all of us about some ways that maps, Indigenous work, settler colonialism continue to be sources of conversation, of action, of resistance, of provocation in the 21st century. And in that spirit, I would like to highlight, so that you can access this yourself, if you look up the Stockbridge History Walking Tour that the community has developed, doing beautiful forms of digital storytelling in the place of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, that was such an important location in the 18th century, and combining maps with video, storytelling, audio, in order to share out the ongoing significance of this place. So with that, I want to begin with a map that I see frequently and that often causes me to stop in my tracks. And I would like to invite all of you, no matter where you might be located, to think if there are any maps like this in your own community. And if so, how you might begin or continue to question them. So this is a map that went up a couple of years ago at the base of the small downtown street known as Spring Street in the town of Williamstown. And at a first glance, it might seem objective, neutral, but in fact is actually a deeply selective and, I would argue, political form of storytelling. This map, as you can see, shows state boundaries. So Massachusetts, Vermont just to the north, New York just to the west, main streets, areas that are protected state forest land, and so on. What I would like to invite us to do in the course of this presentation this evening is to reflect on some of the questions that I have placed below this. What do maps like this mark, make visible, and value? Perhaps equally important, what do they leave out, erase, or deem unimportant? Why does this matter? And how can future maps be different? So I'd like to help you see some of the larger context for this map and then take us on a bit of a trip through time and place, but largely centered in the Northeast, to look at some of the ways and unpack some of the ways that maps have been tools. And this is one of my bigger points I'd like to underscore this evening, that maps are not simply reflections of the world. They are tools, they are arguments, they are often designed to persuade. They are sometimes propaganda in the sense of being persuasive apparatus. And we need to be thinking at every turn about why they exist, what kind of social effects they have in the world or attempt to have, and the ways that we might want to challenge them or put them into conversation with other ways of knowing. So in that spirit, this particular map at the base of Spring Street does not exist in a vacuum. And here, again, I invite you to think about your own community context. Does your community have road signs? Does it have a flag? If so, what kinds of values, histories, narratives are being constructed? In the case of Williamstown, Massachusetts, the town flag, as you can see at the upper left, centers a story focused on colonial settlement. What you're seeing in the center is a replica of an 18th century house that would have been one of the first dwellings constructed by English colonizers in this area. The words underneath it on the flag, culture, education, nature, because there's a lot of emphasis on outdoor recreation, have already begun to craft a story that values wilderness. This is very different than a notion of indigenous homelands, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Additionally, the sign below it, like many town signs in Massachusetts, marks as a founding or an originary date, 1765, in this case, the year of Williamstown's incorporation. It gives an impression that maybe there was not something here before that. It doesn't offer any other place names besides Williamstown, which is the namesake of an English colonizer who was directly implicated in dispossessing the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community. All of this we pass by on a regular basis, and it ought to trouble us. It ought to prompt us to ask harder questions. This is beginning to happen in this town, and I really want to credit here the work of communities, students, local activists, local collaborators for beginning these ripples of change. And I'll show you just a couple of the places where this is occurring and then put this into conversation with some older maps. The first of these, you can see in the background, is the replica house I was referring to before, the 1753 house, coding in the local landscape colonial originary moments as the supposed starting place. But if you read the sign, something is happening. This is new language. In fact, this is a new sign that went up just a couple of years ago. At the bottom of it, it now recognizes the homelands of the Mohicanu or Mohican nation. And this was something that was developed in collaboration with the former cultural affairs director of the tribal nation. So a kind of dissonant story on the land. This is something people drive by and circle by on a daily basis. And it's begun to spark some local conversations. Much more recently, there's no map here, but this is very much about placemaking, right? So telling and building different connections to place. There has been a banner put up on the outside of Williams College that denotes, for the first time, I think, in public space in this way, Mohican homelands, and also contains Mohican language phrasing that was developed with the assistance of one of the tribal linguists. And this has also become a spark point for conversation. It came into being through the work of students and also Bonnie Hartley, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation. This banner, without going into all the details, has become a bit of I'll call it a source of debate about whether it stays up visible in this public space or whether it comes down. So much is happening on the ground, and all of this is occurring against a context or in relation to a context of a long history of colonial cartography that has often been erasive. And by that, I mean, if you go back through I would argue, thousands of maps about this region, there is a long history and practice of European and colonial map making that erases indigenous people or misrepresents them in consequential ways. And that is some of what I want to unpack in a little bit. But to just show you one example of this, I went through the many maps that I have drawn together about the area of Mohican homelands that I've just been reflecting on, where Williamstown is now located. And many of them show nothing about an Indigenous presence in this area, and or they substitute it with some kind of animal. So here we have this beautiful, what I take to be perhaps a great heron, but no sign that between Albany, New York, and Northampton, Massachusetts, there is any human presence, any kind of established community. And this is a map from 1685, when this is predominantly an Indigenous space, right? So there's a kind of erasure or construction of wilderness that very much is happening in order to open the possibility for colonial claiming of this land, right? So there's an intense colonial goal to this type of erasure. This is something that has not gone away. And I was surprised, though not entirely, when I was working with some maps in our college's special collections to find this map, a so-called humorous map from 1935. So filled with little jokes, kind of insider jokes about the campus, that this type of erasure was still occurring, marking out one part of the campus territory with the, again, supposed to be humorous phrase, unexplored territory, and below that a giraffe, and then a very stereotypical invocation of some form of, in this case, I would say Plains Indigenous imagery, right? So erasure as taking different forms, but still actually present in the 20th and I would argue 21st century. And if you have ever traveled down this way along Route 2, the so-called, quote, Mohawk Trail, you will encounter additional examples of this appropriation and stereotypical invocation of Indigenous imagery that distracts from the actual Indigenous homelands in this place, right? So Mohawk being used as a substitute. Yes, Mohawk people have traveled through this area and have had relations with it, but it is being used as a substitute that displaces Mohican and also Abenaki, Nipmuc, and other Indigenous homelands in this area. And this continues right through today. All of this I offer as a bit of preamble to help us see that these are live issues in the 21st century. So this is not a kind of antiquarian talk that I'm hoping to do about maps as something relegated to a distant past, but something that very much still is constructing our present and demands attention, and I would also argue action. To take this into a related domain, and I did want to bring in some artwork. I wanted to connect this in a bigger picture to efforts that are happening across the continent, across the hemisphere, led by Indigenous people, Indigenous artists, critics, organizers, educators, who have long been not only questioning, but actively pushing back against these types of erasure and misrepresentation. And to do this, I will pair two maps from the contemporary artist John Quick-to-See Smith, who is from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and who has an entire series of art, oil, collage, mixed media, interrogating what maps do. And the pairing of images here, the first one, you can see with this dripping paint, concealing, kind of remaking, calling into question, dissolving one of the conventional US state maps, asking us to look more closely, to reflect on what this colonial map is. Where does it fall apart? Where does it lose its coherence? And the second of these maps, building on that, but removing those state names and instead foregrounding the many, many, many individual names of Native nations, past, present, and future. And I wanted to draw out a passage that Smith has written in conjunction with this work. She says, "We are the original owners of this country. Our land was stolen from us by the Euro-American invaders. I can't say strongly enough that my maps are about stolen lands, our very heritage, our cultures, our worldview, our being. Every map is a political map and tells a story that we are alive everywhere across this nation." that is the spirit in which I want to continue today, recognizing, foregrounding, amplifying this kind of intervention. Every map is a political map. To trace what that has meant and continues to mean in Indigenous and European and colonial perspectives, and offer us, I hope, some tools so that when we encounter maps in our daily lives, we may ask different questions of them. We may see them differently. We may educate in a different way. So the next part that I want to shift to are some examples of what we might call Indigenous mapping or counter mapping. So counter mapping having the connotation of being in a critical dialogue with some other map that has been out there and pushing back against it, remaking it, offering people other perspectives. And each one of these we could spend an entire hour reflecting on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to offer some snapshots and then you can follow up on these most certainly if you wish. Many of them are digital resources that are freely accessible online. The first of these, a number of you may have seen before. This has been circulated quite a lot in the last couple of years as land acknowledgements have become more of a practice, one that has been discussed and debated, certainly, but as people across North America and beyond are looking to be able to acknowledge the Indigenous places in which they are situated. And if you're interested in this Native Land digital project, you can access it at the web link I've put at the bottom. One of the impressions that I think is unmistakable from this project is how every inch of the beautiful, life-giving lands and waters of this hemisphere are Indigenous lands. Some of them are marked within a single tribal nation, single community. Some of them are in overlapping places where there has been a lot of exchange and movement and dynamism over time. And this map invites people to put in their own location in order to be able to locate themselves. And that being a process, a beginning process, right? Not a completed process, but the beginning of a process of accountability and recognition. Land acknowledgements, one of those began our event this evening, are now happening in many places. And I find it interesting, compelling that they are also beginning to be marked in public spaces. So not only something that might be recited at an event, but also something that is physically out on the land and that passersby can encounter no matter when they may be walking by. And so this is one example of a Welcome to Chicago sign that has grown out of a land acknowledgement process at the Field Museum in Chicago, which itself is very much in the midst of refashioning its engagement with local tribal nations in the greater Chicago area and the Great Lakes. Here in the Northeast, this map has gotten a lot of traction by friend and colleague Lisa Brooks, who is Abenaki, from her work on the Common Pot, the recovery of native space in the Northeast, in which she is marking out a number of Indigenous communities, ancestral and continuing locations across the Northeast. One of the aspects of this, when I bring this into a classroom, that always jumps out at students is how much this is organized along rivers, watersheds, right? The terrain, rather than along the neat geometric lines that today separate, say, the state of Massachusetts from the state of Vermont, the state of Rhode Island. Lisa Brooks knows full well where those lines are, but this is a map that is deliberately taking those out and foregrounding a different type of space, a different connection. I would also note in this the power of not centering, not in this case, not even making visible the US-Canada border, and thinking about the ways that borders like that have been used in a manner that has separated Indigenous homelands and kinship networks. What happens when those borders recede or are just put to the side, and instead other forms of relations with land, with water, with other human communities are recognized. If you are interested in more of these kinds of maps, this one of Haudenosaunee homelands just to the west, I would encourage folks to access the Decolonial Atlas website project, which has many, many, many different maps from across North America and beyond. Much of this predates the digital turn, though. So what I've shown you just previously has in different ways engaged with GIS, or geographic information systems, using digital tools of environmental and place-based work. But I do want to point to some of the much longer efforts that tribal nations have been undertaking in order to mark out their significant places. And this is a beautiful map by Melissa Tantaquidgeon-Zobel from her book titled Medicine Trail, The Life and Lessons of Gladys Tantaquidgeon. It is about Mohegan, so not Mohegan, Mohegan places of significance. And this has such a fine-grained scale. So thinking about some of the differences between Lisa Brooks's map, which has us zoomed way out to see the entirety of the Northeast, and a map like this one, which brings us down to an intimate level in order to see individual community members' home sites, cemeteries, places of great importance in origin stories in the 18th century, in the 21st century. And these places are accompanied in the book Medicine Trail by stories, many of them conveyed by Gladys Tantaquidgeon, that talk about the significance and make it not only about marking the place, but also what is the story of the place? How does this continue to shape new generations' understandings of being Mohegan? In more recent times, it has been wonderful to see some of the building out of this through a digital format that the Mohegan tribe has undertaken. And just one example of this is a walking tour titled the Uncasleep Walking Trail, developed in collaboration with the Norwich Historical Society, which has a combination of elements. So I definitely in this presentation don't want us to think about maps as just a two-dimensional piece of paper, but rather something that can take form on the land, that can be interactive, that can involve telling stories in particular places or accessing them on your phone or digital device. And in this case, again, you can access this website for the Uncasleep Walking Trail. You are able to click through to photographs and text that the tribe has developed themselves. I had a very small collaborative role in some of this, but this was a tribal-led project, and learn more from a Mohegan perspective. A lot of this work is a counterpoint to the erasure narrative. And to deepen what I mean by that a little bit, I want to cite the work of Jean O'Brien, who's a leading Indigenous scholar, and her book, Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, really unfolds the nature, the impacts of this kind of erasure. And the point she makes is that across many centuries, colonial New Englanders, through maps, but also monuments, school curricula, plays, performances, have undertaken many tactics for making it seem as if Indigenous people in this region are relegated to the past, a very distant past, rather than being participants in modernity and shapers of their own futures. So if you are interested in this concept and the ways that countermapping relates to erasure, I would definitely recommend Jeannie O'Brien's work. Just a couple other examples to deepen our sense of these contemporary mapping projects. Some of them invite us to reckon with violence and to rethink the signage that is so prevalent in the built environment around us as you drive down the street, as you walk through your town, that often sanitizes or denies or downplays historical violence that has pervasively impacted communities. And the example I want to highlight here is work by Alyssa Mount Pleasant, who's of Tuscarora descent. She's a historian at SUNY Buffalo, and she has been working on a project that she calls Drive-By History, Roadside Markers in Haudenosaunee Homelands. Much of this work has involved tracking down and then critically contextualizing these roadside markers that are across the state of New York, and particularly addressing the ones related to what has been called the Sullivan campaign of the Revolutionary War. This, in terms of mapping, the Sullivan campaign was incredibly destructive for Haudenosaunee communities. And it was a campaign led by American troops. Right, so complicating narratives of colonialism here. Here it was United States as it began to emerge, sending out military forces in order to destroy the crops, the homes, the sacred belongings, and the lives of Haudenosaunee people during the American Revolution. And the project that Dr. Mount Pleasant is involved in challenges the signs that are currently so prevalent on the landscape that valorize the Sullivan campaign, that treat it as an honorable moment of beginnings for the new United States, instead talking about the impacts on Haudenosaunee people who were sent into displacement and many of whom became refugees in their own homelands as a consequence of this violence. Perhaps a little bit more local, but very much on this theme of addressing reckoning with violence through mapping. I wanted to say a little bit about a project in the Connecticut or Connecticut River Valley that has centrally involved placemaking. And you can see from this photo in the local news coverage that literally people gathered around very, very local maps in order to investigate what happened in this place. Wissahickon or Peskeomscut, also known as Turner's Falls, was a site of tremendous violence during King Philip's War of the late 17th century. It was a gathering of multiple tribal communities along a waterfall in this beautiful watershed that became targeted in the spring of 1676. And there was a massacre perpetrated by colonial troops that caused enormous losses of life in this area. The colonial maps produced in the direct aftermath of that war did not speak to that as a site of Indigenous suffering. And this particular map, again, we could spend all hour looking at this, was produced in 1677. It is New England flipped on its side in the sense that Cape Cod is down here. This is the Connecticut River. And it is a map that says very, very little about the enormous violences endured by Indigenous people during this conflict. And Wissahickon, Peskeomscut, up here is noted, but barely registers as a site of such significance. Instead, what is on this map are English towns that were attacked by native forces. So it is a map of English suffering that does very little to contextualize why native people were rising up in a resistance movement. How all this relates is that in most colonial maps and accounts of what happened at these waterfalls, there is almost no sense that any native people survived that, but they did. And this is what the collaboration between Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, Abenaki representatives, as well as archaeologists, landowners, local residents, is bringing to light. It is an immediate form of military resistance that occurred that, again, has not been mapped. It has not been acknowledged in the written sources, but is coming to light through place-based work, including archaeological investigations. So the map itself is changing as we speak. And just two more touchstones here before then taking us into a little bit of a different space of conversation. The team that Kevin McBride here, an archaeologist from University of Connecticut, has been involved in, that has been working on the waterfall and its aftermath, has also been working on the Pequot War and the landscapes that surrounded that conflict of the 1630s, so 40 years prior to this. And very similar, what their work that is both community connected and then archaeologically related and working with local landowners has done is to change the map. What I mean by that is that the most kind of well-known visual representation of a colonial massacre of Pequot people that took place at Mystic in 1637 is this image. This is a horrifying image. I am often not sure whether to even share this, but I do carefully to offer us one look at the scale of violence that began to affect Native people in the Northeast very, very shortly after the onset of colonization. What this is showing, this schematic, is a Pequot village. These are Pequot homes surrounded by a protective palisade, but being fired upon by colonial troops here in the inner circle, and then by Native allies of those colonial troops who were involved for their own reasons. What this map does not indicate is that there were survivors. There were Pequot survivors of this violence who made their way out of this site of intense suffering, who managed to regroup, to survive, and to continue into the future. And that is what some of the contemporary work of remapping that the Pequot War Battlefields Project has been involved in, has been doing. One small, but I think consequential way that I have begun to trace this out in my own work, I can tell the story briefly through this map. And you might not gather from looking at what seems like a pretty simple map that this was actually one of the most difficult to develop in the course of working on what became my first book, Memory Lands, a study of King Philip's War and its aftermath. What this map is showing are some of the locations across an Atlantic world, so spanning the Atlantic Ocean, to which Native people who were taken prisoner at the end of King Philip's War were sent into slavery. This is a process, the enslavement of Native people by colonizers, that began arguably during the Pequot War, but actually much before that in Wampanoag homelands, and extended right through the 17th and into the 18th century. And why this was a difficult map to create is the challenge of tracing out the destinations to which colonizers were sending enslaved Native men, women, children, and elders. And among those locations you can see include the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, North Africa, Tangier, Bermuda. There has been a lot of active community-based work as well around this history of enslavement. And then also sites of resistance and refuge seeking up here at Odanak or St. Francis, and also Wabanaki communities, to which Native people were taking themselves in order to seek continued freedom in the face of this onslaught, right? So this is a map of both enslavement and freedom, of liberation, of possibility, and it is one that I fully expect to need to be updated as more information surfaces and as fuller acknowledgments are made of the stories that community members have long stewarded about their ancestors' own experiences. And finally, before I shift gears a little bit, this may be one of the most important slides to recognize how much is not mapped. What is not made visible? Some knowledge and places are not appropriate for external circulation. It is not good, it is not right to put them on a map and to then put it on the internet or put it out in a public space. And so in that sense, this slide is to gesture to the importance of strategic invisibility, protection for reasons, for example, to prevent looting or vandalism of sensitive places, or places that are connected to spiritual knowledge that is intended to remain within a community, not be circulated. So this is also my way of signaling that there are a number of maps in my own book, and there are many, many, many geographies that are not mapped. And there's a range of reasons for leaving them out, some of which I point to in the book and some of which I leave completely silent. And that too is something that may evolve over time. So with the last part today, what I'd like to do is take us on a brief tour through some examples of historical maps and offer a few tools for approaching them critically, asking different questions, maybe putting them into conversation with other forms of knowledge. My challenge in putting this together is the abundance of maps that we could share out. There are so many of which have been digitized. And so I want you to know that for each one of these, there are probably a dozen others that we could equally be talking about. But I think these will help us see the main highlights. So I've been talking in some ways around the ways that colonization and map making or cartography have been intimately connected. But I want to offer some more details on that. And then at the same time, suggest some ways that even maps produced by colonizers or in context of colonization may contain places, points of reference, toponyms, place names, language that can point us to other experiences, including sites of Indigenous continuance, resistance, and placemaking. This is, I think, a map, or an image, I should say, a painting that does a great deal of work to encapsulate a certain European mentality of the early modern era. So this is a painting, a portrait of Elizabeth I, the English monarch, and you can see two notable things in this quite lush portrait. In the background is the Spanish Armada, so pointing us to inter-imperial conflict as something that is shaping, in this case, English desires to expand influence across the world. And then for the purposes of this talk, where she has her hand. She famously, in this Armada portrait, has her hand placed over a globe. And as scholars have pointed out, she doesn't have her hand just randomly placed. She has it, in fact, placed over North America. This is not coincidental in 1588. This is when the English are just beginning to embark on colonization of the Americas. This is a project that involves, as I have noted, intense desires to claim, profit, and religiously convert the indigenous peoples in North and other parts of the Americas. So what happens to cartography once colonization begins to accelerate? And here I'm going to focus only on English cartographic contexts for reasons of time. One piece of this that we always need to keep in mind is the vast amount of ignorance, uncertainty, anxiety that the English had as they began looking westward across the Atlantic. And one way we can maybe colorfully have this impressed upon us is this map, the Carta Marina from 1539, showing the waters off of in the North Atlantic filled with sea monsters of all kinds, threatening ships, threatening mariners, threatening to sink them, to wreak all havoc on them. And this, right, gives us a glimpse into the anxieties about the unknown. The fact that for Europeans of this moment in time, looking westward was a process of reckoning with their own lack of knowledge and then seeking ways to fill that in while also being cognizant of how deeply invested they were in the goals of colonization. In 1607, when English efforts to colonize the Virginia area inhabited by the Powhatan Confederacy really commenced, there's then a flurry of maps that come out of this. The John Smith, who's involved in that, is directly connected with. And I wanted to highlight a couple features of these maps because I think they're applicable to so many maps that you might encounter, including in New England, filled with references to the indigenous people of this place, right? So it is immediately apparent from this map from 1612, if we zoom in, that this is a place filled with indigenous people, filled with indigenous leaders, homes, political networks, and settlements. This is not a vacant space. There is no way for you to look at this map and come away with the impression the English thought it was empty. They did not. They recognized that they were entering very tentatively into the Powhatan Confederacy. And they misconstrued many, many, many details and dynamics of that, but there was, as this map shows, at least a recognition of this as a complex and dynamic indigenous space. And so if you look closely, one of the political seats here, Werowocomoco, shown here, and then Jamestown, just perched very precariously upriver over here. But all of these are indigenous places. And you can see some of the iconography is referencing indigenous homes throughout this. To put this another way, in recognizing a more contemporary map here, this is the political space, the deeply complex, powerful indigenous political space into which the Jamestown colonists are moving. And one of the reasons why they are so keen to map this is recognizing that they are reliant upon the Powhatan Confederacy for food, for diplomatic relations, for access to the interior, right? And that this map is part of an attempt to persuade English investors back in England about the nature of this space. It is fertile, it is filled with human and natural resources. So thinking about this as a tool of persuasion, this map was not designed to just circulate as an art object, it was designed to accelerate colonization and to share information about what was likely to be involved in that. To put this another way, though, and here to invoke an indigenous material belonging, this is an indigenous space that has been represented through indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous materiality that both complement and I would say sometimes challenge the colonial cartography. So this item, sometimes called Powhatan's mantle, has been argued to be a cartographic representation using an indigenous epistemology, meaning that the orientation is not the same as how John Smith was creating his map. But what this is showing is arguably the political organization of this Indigenous confederacy in which the central body or organizing fire is surrounded by the tributary communities who are in a deeply complicated and reciprocal set of relations, right? This item, I would note, is not currently in Indigenous hands. It is currently claimed by the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University in England. And so I'd invite us to think about how cartographic and heritage objects like this have often been dispossessed, taken away, and then claimed within colonial contexts. To bring us to New England, you may see many similarities to the map I was just talking through about Powhatan and Virginia area. Almost as soon as colonization from an English vantage begins to turn its attention to New England, maps begin to get produced. And this is for much the same colonial logic, to send back to investors, political promoters back in England, and hopefully from their vantage, incur more investments, more people, more money for colonization. But these maps are unstable. They are not simply about the imagination, the desires and ambitions of colonists. They are also, however inadvertently, records of Indigenous continuity and political power. To zoom in a little bit and show you what I mean, this map by William Wood from 1635 or 1634, titled The South Part of New England, is filled with names that you might recognize today if you have ever traveled around New England, such as Boston, Charleston, Dorchester, right? This is Boston Harbor. But also within this, if you look closely, are many native names related to the Massachusetts Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and other communities, Abenaki as well in the north part. And one example of this, if you look in the north part, are several places that recognize communities along the Merrimack River. So here, recognizing Pennacook presence, these triangles with the circle around them indicating a native village, right? And these are all over the map. William Wood knows that this is very active native space. He also knows that colonization is seeking inroads into this and needing to interact with, negotiate with, be diplomatically in relation with native leaders. And so that is some of what is showing up on the map. The other thing I think about in terms of this iconography is how limited it can be and how it, from a colonial perspective, conceptualizes native places. And these triangles that reference a native village, so physical structures on the land, are important. But they also don't recognize or don't point us to the way that native home sites would frequently move with the seasons in order to be good stewards of place, to not exhaust the land, to be closer to resources on a seasonal basis. That kind of movement or mobility is not foregrounded in this map. Neither are the many paths, portages, points of connection across this intricate Indigenous homelands. Instead, we have an emphasis on kind of buildings, right? And this is an English colonial mentality that gets repeated again and again in these kinds of maps. Moving forward a little bit in time, I see, with some exceptions, in maps of New England, colonial maps of New England, the erasure beginning to come in as we move through time. And we could look at a number of different examples of that, but to pull out just one, which is fairly famous, this one, a map of New England from 40 years roughly after William Wood's map by John Seller, the hydrographer to the King of England, who is basing his map on all different forms of information. Hearsay, he's copying from previous maps, he's making things up as he goes along in different places where he just does not know what is there. And all of that gets flattened onto this one surface, which, as you can see, even from this zoomed out vantage, has many blanks. There are places where, for example, the Mohegans country, where Indigenous presence and sovereignty are recognized, but there's also a great deal of emptiness here. And the trees, the hills that are being used are doing a kind of cultural persuasive work to indicate that it's mostly empty. It's not peopled in these places. And we can trace this out through both details of this, right? This again, Mohican homelands, there's nothing. There's literally nothing shown in this space, but the only settlements or habitations are the English ones, Northampton and Albany, again, right? These are trees and mountains, but there are no indigenous settlements shown, even though they are here. And even more so as we go along. I did want to, I don't think this is a tangent, I think this is related, but to say something about the animals, because something you might notice as you look through these older maps are how frequently animals appear. In this case, we've got a turkey, this may be a sheep, maybe a cow, not certain what this is. And animals are all over these maps. Sometimes they are decorative, but oftentimes they are serving an argumentative purpose. So to draw out an example from a different map, beavers feature strongly in this map, or in these two maps from the 18th century, the latter one quite famous by Herman Moll. And the beavers, which are very muscular here, are not incidental or accidental additions. They are in fact signaling on the surface of a map how hugely important the beaver fur trade was to French, Dutch, English colonizers. It is a source of potential profit, enormous profit. And so they're paying attention to the other than human beings who inhabit these places. So another way of saying this is you should always be looking into the margins, into the cartouches or the decorative elements of these maps, and asking critical questions of them as well. Why are these images here? How do they bolster or maybe possibly challenge the argument of the map? To return back, though, to Mohican homelands and the area that becomes Williamstown, we see here again the blank, but then also an emerging set of private property maps. And this I really wanted to emphasize because this is a major motivation in the 17th, 18th, and right through today, motivation for the colonial creation of maps in order to document where private property lines have been claimed, and then to use that in order to assert that private property. So many of these maps are actually held in courthouses, in registries of deeds, and they are understood to be part of binding legal agreements from a colonial perspective. And so this is actually one of the, I think it's sometimes held out as the first quote, map of Williamstown. And what it is a property division showing different allotments of land that were to be allocated to English colonists where they were to build their homes. This is privileging a narrative of private property. And it's also misleading. I know that people have sometimes looked at this map and then assumed that the name of the English person on each of these tracts meant that that person actually settled there and built a house and began to farm it. In fact, much of this was speculative, imaginative projection of the future, and many of these colonizers did not, in fact, ever set foot in this place. Instead, they sold off their landed interests. But I do think it's important for us to point to the role of private property and capitalistic development as a motivator for map creation. Where I want to wrap things up so that we then have some time for questions is to highlight a couple of examples from my own research processes and travels where I have found provocations, pushback in these seemingly colonial maps that attest to longstanding forms of Indigenous resilience, continuance, and endeavors to maintain their presence on homelands, despite colonial efforts to dispossess and seize those lands. So a couple of these examples from across the Northeast. The first from the I nearly misspoke here, but maybe in a more accurate way, I was going to say the Wampanoag Registry of Deeds. This is the Registry of Deeds housed in Plymouth County, Massachusetts, that collects land documents. And many of these documents are by and about Wampanoag people. But I want to share this picture of where these documents live to have us thinking critically about who holds the collections and what does that tell us about political power in the present. These documents are not held by the Wampanoag communities. They're not held within their own cultural or archive spaces or museums. They're held by the colonial state. Many of them have to do with mapping and with assertions of property. But the example I wanted to share out actually has no visual map for me to put on the screen for you. It instead is a map that is being formed, enacted through written language and tells a story of Native people in the immediate aftermath of King Philip's War. So that devastating series of violences in the late 17th century that impacted so many communities. These are Wampanoag representatives who have survived that. They and their families, their children have survived, and they are going into the English legal space in order to advocate to have continued use rights, access rights, ability to harvest particular berries and plants, medicinal sources within their homelands. And as you can see from the handwriting, right, this is in 17th century writing. It is often challenging to read. I think that's why some of these documents have not been used as much as they ought to be, even though within tribal communities, these documents are heavily known and have been used in federal recognition and other processes. But these are the names and the marks of Samson, Peter, and Joshua, who are 3 Wampanoag representatives who are doing what they can to protect these places and to protect not only the human people who are maintaining their homes here, but also the plants, the animals, the birds. And that set of relations is something that so exceeds what is referenced in the vast majority of colonial documents, right? So this is offering us a very different kind of land ethic and understanding of stewardship, kinship, and caretaking. And there's no visual map, but it's all about mapping and about caring for place. The other example I wanted to share comes from a project that I've been circling around for about the last 12 years and is now, I hope, the seeds of a second book project. And increasingly, the colonizer who you see in this portrait at the Yale Art Gallery is moving off stage. Ezra Stiles, the one-time president of Yale College in the 18th century. But I'm using him as a critical touchstone, a conversation partner, however difficult he is, in order to talk about Native, colonial, and also African-American relationships in the 18th century, before, during, and after the American Revolution. Ezra Stiles might not seem whatsoever to be a promising lens onto Indigenous experiences. And yet, there are points of access. And what I mean by that is that in his voluminous manuscript records, there are so many traces in maps, in sketches, in what he called his itineraries, so his travel journals, as he, on horseback and on foot, traveled across New England over and over again. There are so many traces of the Indigenous worlds that he was glimpsing, often very imperfectly through his own colonial lens, but still seeing some of it and interacting with in the 18th century. So, for example, this is one of my favorite maps showing New Haven. It is not centering Yale College. It is not centering the colonial presence, even though that's marked out on this grid here. It is noting that the colonial settlement is built very, very close by what he describes as an Indian fort. And that's what this mark here is. And this is just one of, I think, thousands of his sketches that point to the Indigenous landscape of this area, past and present to him in the 18th century. Another example, he loved to visit and to represent houses, all kinds of houses, colonial, Indigenous, and otherwise. And he often sketched them and created diagrams. So these are, I would say, maps of people's home spaces in the 18th century. In this case, he was down among the Niantic community and also with Mohegan people, sketching homes, some of which belonged to Native women, some of which to Native men and their families. Something that I would highlight about these is that he's not creating these sketches in isolation. If you actually read all of his notes that accompany this, he is traveling through this community in the company of Native people. They are escorting him around. To think of it otherwise, they are determining what he has access to, what he doesn't have access to, where he is kept away from, what he's allowed to see, what he's not allowed to see. And so I think his drawings raise very important questions about what is represented and all of the places in which Indigenous agency and ability to shape what colonizers are doing are affecting the kinds of records that have lasted into the 21st century. But the story I wanted to end with here has a gesture at the kind of promise, the challenges of these maps. So this one, he is traveling along Long Island Sound in 1761. He returns to this area many times. He meets with community members. He meets with colonial leaders. He talks to people all the time. And on this, he is using letters to mark out a couple places of significance. One of them is a colonial house, Colonel Champlain, shown right here. But what caught my eye when I was beginning to learn more about this area is the reference to the letter A, what is marked here, and what he refers to as the sachem's house. I did not know initially who this was referencing. And in the course of research, which has been wide-ranging, has involved many, many different conversations, as well as working in archives, it became clear that this was the house of the sachem known as Thomas Ninigret, or also King Tom, who was present and had a leadership role in the 18th century. And this photograph is the only one I've been able to find to date that shows this house while it was still standing. It is no longer existent on the land today. But this house is built in what an architectural historian might call an English clapboard style, and yet it's a fully indigenous dwelling, right? This is a place that Thomas Ninigret has built for his own purposes and has made many decisions to inhabit this kind of dwelling, which is quite different if you compare it to some of the Wituash that Stiles was sketching in 1671, that Native people were continuing to live in, but some were also choosing or being pressured to live in these timber-framed houses. And so I wound up doing a lot of reading about this, the sachem's house, and it's a fascinating story. It tells a lot about political power in the 18th century. But I then realized I was only seeing one slice of the story, and the ways that focusing too much on the house of a leader, an elite, in this case, a native elite, Thomas Ninigret, might distract us from the broader landscape of everyday people. And so when I began to produce maps of my own, I realized I could not have just the sachem's house here, but also needed some others. And the one that I want to kind of draw this together is a house that is not on Ezra Stiles' map. It would be somewhere up here, but it's not on his map. And yet it tells a very different story. And this is the house of Joseph Jeffrey, who is a native man of Niantic and possibly other tribal community descent in the 18th century. Joseph Jeffrey's house is still standing. It is now a private property. You can view a listing for it on Zillow, I think, because it went up for sale a couple of years ago. So there's lots of photographs out there, but it's a private house. It is not located within the contemporary Narragansett Tribal Nation Reservation. And it is a house that the owner and the builder of it, his life tells a very different story. Joseph Jeffrey, a native person who was politically connected to Thomas Ninigret, but also not of his necessarily most innermost circle, and who supported himself and his family through entrepreneurship, and particularly by building a sawmill and using the timber produced from that both to construct his own home and then to sell to others in the vicinity, likely both tribal members and then colonial people living in this area. And I had this aha moment in looking at Google Earth from this area, that in some ways the story of Joseph Jeffrey has been there all along, right out on the land. And if you look at this, the name of it today, Sawmill Pond, is actually a reference to that long history of there having been a sawmill in this area. It just doesn't have his name appended to it, but Sawmill Pond, pointing us to the way that the land itself, the place names accumulated on it, can constitute an archive. And here I'm invoking work by Lisa Brooks and a number of other scholars and community interpreters. Going out to this place, there are a couple other layers I wanted to share with you. I was so struck that physically, quite adjacent to this site, you can still see the old mill races. You can still see the brook that flows out of here. But interestingly, it's become overbuilt by a beaver dam. And so thinking in these maps about how much of their focus is on the human built environment, the human landscape, but also needing to recognize that the other than human continues to shape this land and can do so in ways that sometimes actually bring about the destruction of the human traces, right? The beaver dam, if left here, if allowed to continue here, may eventually flood this landscape in quite different ways. But the place I really wanted to end on today is bringing us back to the contemporary moment and the fact that mapping is always political. It is always part of struggle, whether that is visibly apparent or not. And that the very ability to map sites, in this case in Narragansett homelands, has been closely wrapped up with ongoing legal challenges that the Narragansett tribe has long been contending with. In the 1990s, the tribe was dealing on their homelands with a number of efforts by private property developers to build condo and other developments on sensitive homelands. In the face of that, the tribe supported a significant archaeological project in order to document and to map Narragansett home sites from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries on these ancestral lands. And I'm not showing those maps, those are tribal property maps, but I do want to share a press clipping from the Boston Globe from 1990, which signals that legal contestation. And the very fact that the tribe had to go to this enormous effort to document, to map, to archaeologically survey in their own homelands in order to be able to bring that into a court of law and make the case for continuing to protect their own places. These are some of the circumstances under which maps are produced. And I hope that we can always be attentive to that and recognize that nothing is neutral about these maps, not even Google Maps, and what is made visible sometimes without the consent of those who live in these places. So on that note, I will stop here and would be very glad to have some questions and discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christine, for this fabulous talk. So a discussion has been unfolding in the chat throughout the talk about the Mercator projection and its usage in some of these new decolonial maps that are mapping First Nations land. So several people in the chat would love if you could discuss the implications of superimposing these colonial cartographic standards onto this kind of map meant to represent Native peoples.
Absolutely, and I'm delighted to know this conversation was unfolding. Looking down in the chat, I see a comment, I think from Bill Morris, asking about, because I think this might summarize some of this, the implications of mapping Native First Nations peoples with essentially colonial cartographic standards like this. This is a huge topic of conversation. When I shared some of those digital resources in my first year seminar, that was immediately actually where the discussion went. Is this not just another form of colonialism? And where the discussion eventually wound up going was about these maps as acts of translation and of strategy, right? That the folks who have been involved in collaborating them often have a really detailed kind of about and methods statement that describes exactly these kinds of considerations. What is lost, what is actually quite misleading in choosing to work with certain digital interfaces or with GIS, or to collaborate, for example, with Google Earth and other big corporate entities that claim different proprietary uses over data, where there's a lot that can be put at risk by entering into that collaboration. I would not ever purport to speak for communities or folks who have engaged in these collaborations, who have many of their own reasons for doing so, but would say that I find it compelling, fascinating, difficult, right, to grapple with mediation and the fact that many of the digital tools that are out there that someone who's not a technical specialist can kind of pick up off the shelf and begin building something with have built into them, really baked in at a foundational level, heavily colonial assumptions. And there are ways in which they can never be commensurate or compatible with forms of place knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge orientation that is not colonial, right? But that there's sometimes a translation project that is happening in order to be able to engage certain audiences. The other project that I'm thinking of here, and I wish that I had an image of it because of this discussion in the chat. So in Native Hawaiian context, there's been some beautiful collaborative, participatory, community-led mapping that is exploring things like how do you show time of day, seasonality, sunlight, dusk, the different effects of the tides when the water comes in, when it goes out, the kind of multi-sensory approach that a 2D map just fails at it right at every turn. And the folks working on that, I wish I had the citation at hand, but if you look up these projects, I think Renee Poulani-Lewis is one of them. It's very, very thoughtful about what can be accomplished through the digital rather than simply writing off the digital as a monolith that is always colonized, instead seeing it as one of several tools. But the other thing that that I would underscore here is that none of these maps can replicate the fullness of the land itself and people's relationships with the land in an embodied, walking through being in that place way. And that always needs to be kind of in the mix so that folks are not misled by the maps as the beginning and the end of the story, but rather as points of inflection or places where something may come into a public awareness that had not, and then it may recede from that. And so that's how I talk a lot about maps as process, and placemaking is often the concept or the phrase that I go to because it enables us to see that process element. So mapping is a verb rather than the map as the product that lives on a shelf or hangs on the wall. I hope that gets at some of what you're asking. I am not a GIS specialist, I should emphasize here, and the extreme limits of my own technological ability are something I think about all the time and may eventually take a GIS class. But the folks who really specialize in that have thought about a lot of these considerations, including projections, including something else I should say, how can maps show change over time and not freeze a community or a form of knowledge on the screen or on the page, but rather recognize the ever-evolving fluidity to that.
Great, thank you. And a question from another historian of the colonial Northeast, from Bill Hart at formerly of Middlebury. Wonderful presentation, thank you, but a point of clarification. I know of the indigenous people of the Hudson River Valley as Mohicans, yet you, Rachel Wheeler, and other historians use the term Mohican, which I thought was a term invented by James Fenimore Cooper. Does it matter which term we use?
I did not mention James Fenimore Cooper, but the Last of the Mohicans, which is both a 19th century novel and then a film with Daniel Day-Lewis, has very much continue that erasure narrative, right? And so that's something that the community is still contending with, right? Here I'm using Mohican as the word that the community today uses, and it's part of their own designation. I am not a linguist and would defer to their own language project on that, but I appreciate the question. And something else maybe to build off that a little bit is that place names themselves are multiple, they're often contested, and spellings get perpetuated, right, through many of these colonial maps, that a colonist misheard something said by an indigenous person to describe their own community in 16 whatever, and then that gets repeated because many of these colonial maps are based on copying, right, where the map maker is not going out to survey the land themselves, they're actually building off of previous maps. And so those erroneous place names then get kind of carried forward through centuries and then sometimes held up in courts of law as, well, this is what it must be, even if a community themselves has a different understanding of that. And place names themselves, the recovery of them, right, the bringing back. I wish I could have begun this evening with a fuller description of, Williamstown in Indigenous language words, but that is work that is just happening kind of as we speak. And I really look forward to how that may change how people speak about these very places.
All right, and a question from someone who I know has some GIS expertise, actually. What would your suggestions for a cartographer today be to avoid replicating some of these exclusionary and colonial practices?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, how can the practice be different? How to be accountable? If there are relationships that exist or that could be built related to the place where you are, or the communities that are involved in the place that you are mapping, reaching out, doing so in a reciprocal way so that it's not extractive, that you're just asking for information, but is there something that you could offer, whether it's skills, resources, honoraria for knowledge that might be shared? That is one set of practices. Participatory mapping, I think, goes even deeper, right? So community-based participatory research projects in which communities themselves are shaping the very nature of the questions that are asked and the outcomes that are supposed to result from that. And then active participants at every stage of that process, including editing, revising, making corrections. I think that's an even deeper type of methodological intervention. All of this should emphasize it's easier said than done, and that a lot of what underlies what I have spoken about today is the time, the care, the hard work, the often challenges of communications involved in trying to do this work in an accountable way. And it is, as I understand it, speaking just for myself, it's going to be an absolutely lifelong process. I have learned some things along the way, but a tremendous amount more. And even looking back on my own book, the maps that are in there, they were made by a professional cartographer. I sort of told him what to put on them, but that is very different than a participatory mapping process. And so that's something that I'm thinking about right now for second projects, including ones that may live in a digital space, but also in the form of a printed page.
Great, thank you. And a question from our friend Ellery Fouch. Thank you for an illuminating and invigorating presentation. Somewhat related to the comments/conversation about the Mercator projection, I have a question about the grid and the cross. One of the maps that noted Indigenous villages via triangles seemed to indicate towns or English settlements with small circles topped by crosses or intersecting lines. Did that actually indicate built churches, or did it simply signify British/Christian settlements somewhat coincidentally?
Excellent question. And yeah, we could have a whole talk about religious elements of mapping and how deeply that affects all of the colonial maps I just shared, right? So in 17th century New England, a meeting house wouldn't be distinct from a church, but the meeting house would be a gathering place. But the cross signifying the Christian establishment of that town, right? And then aspirations for that to be, I should always say aspirations from a colonial vantage for that to be extended into Indigenous spaces through processes of missionization and conversion, which are often deeply violent and deeply exploitative. But that itself, I'm thinking in the 17th century of a set of so-called praying towns that develop across the Northeast, Native people creating these in complex relationships with missionaries, and often building things like English-style meeting houses that are maybe on the surface of it English, in appearance, but the practice and the reasons for that are deeply Indigenous. And so that's something that the maps of that era that show these praying towns as sort of accomplished sites of Christianization are not in accordance with what was actually happening, and with how communities today think about those sites in relation to religious conversion. Something else you're reminding me of, because I did mention New Haven, that there's a marvelous article about the Puritan religious cosmological origins of the grid in New Haven as something that is related to theological understandings. And so it's actually a Puritan sacred space that is being instantiated through that 9 square grid. And if you didn't know that, you might think it was more like 19th century urban planning and attempts to rationalize space, but it's actually a very different origin story. And when I've shared that article with students, it's been incredibly eye-opening to know that grids around us can have all of these connotations, some of which are apparent, but some of which are kind of deeply encoded, and the meanings of which may have been lost over time, right? Or may have fallen away, but are now retrievable through some research.
All right, and I have a question for you, if I may.
Sure.
Returning to this idea of erasure and this visual erasure through these representations of wilderness that are absent figures. I'm thinking of really interesting work done by art historians on the early modern world in an early modern colonial context about maritime painting becoming this interesting site of erasure of the violence of the transatlantic slave trade, particularly Dutch maritime painting. And I'm wondering, and forgive me if this starts to get a little bit too modern for your particular area of study, but I'm curious if you see any kind of analogy that can be drawn to that in 19th century landscape painting, and that kind of more artistic rather than cartographic representation of wilderness.
Yeah, oh, that's a wonderful question. And when I've taught this class about cartography a number of different times, we always do at least one, often several sessions in the college art museums, both here at Williams and then when I was at Mount Holyoke College, in order to work with landscape paintings and other forms of visual, sculptural, material culture representation. The image that I'm thinking of here, so this sighting here, I used to teach at Mount Holyoke College, and one of the signature pieces in their art collection is a painting by Albert Bierstadt of Hetch Hetchy Valley, and in the West, suffused in light, these massive towering stone landscapes and a herd of deer or elk in the center. And the way we go there with students, the way that we talk about that is often of that as a particular image in the 19th century of American wilderness. It's hugely romantic. It is about nature, pristine, and there's no mention visually in that this is an indigenous space in which indigenous people were and were still living, right, at the time when he painted that, and that they were forcibly removed from many sites that became national parks in order to further the construction of the supposedly vacant nature wilderness. And so that expulsion of Native people in order to create empty wilderness that these paintings are signaling towards, right, that kind of dynamic, I think is so vital to give people tools to see, because once you see that, you then can't look at these 19th century paintings the same way ever again. And many of those paintings are, they're not just about place, they're also about temporality and anticipating a certain future that is to come. So I'm thinking of Thomas Cole here painting the oxbow in Nonotuck, Pocumtuck homelands down by Northampton, Massachusetts, and the ways in which that bend in the river has been read as a question mark about what the future of the United States is going to be, right? And so all of these, I think of maps in the more conventional cartographic form that we've been talking about as not only about place, but also about time and anticipatory, in fact, trying to bring into being a different future, some of which is hugely colonial, as we saw, and some of which is very different than that. And that kind of lens to me is very exciting, because it opens up the possibilities for how we think about sources, how we think about collections, how we think about different points of entry into knowledge in a much more interdisciplinary, capacious way. And some days I think I live in a history department as a professional home, but this work is so much bigger than any one discipline can adequately grapple with. And I think the cartography is a great lens into that, and an opportunity to just bring everything to bear on what is place, what can place be here and in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, and thank you for everyone who's joined us tonight. Based on some of the comments in the chat, which I'd suggest you quickly read through before we end, people seem to have been extremely invigorated and intrigued by what you've spoken about tonight. So I think you definitely have given people some tools to take out into the world with them. And we hope to see you all same time, same place next month to talk about sex and gender in the archive. So have a wonderful Wednesday night, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.